Reader response theory. Readers play two roles simultaneously when they are reading a text. The first is authorial audience. This is where readers read knowing that they are reading literature created by someone else. There is an awareness that they are reading literature. In a narrative audience, readers follow the story as if it were happening in real time. The reader becomes a sort of observer or even participant in the story, which requires them to suspend reality and invest themselves in the reading. So who is it that determines the actual meaning of a story or a literary text? Is meaning created solely by the author? In this question, the issue is, how would you know what it is that the author intended? That would require access to any records that the author might have created, where he or she states what the intent was. You could also compare the work that you're evaluating to other writers by the same author to try to determine similarities and differences and try to glean the meaning that way. Neither one of these methods is always possible, and that is problematic. On the other hand, is meaning created only by the reader? So here at issue, we know that poems and stories don't just create themselves, right? So it starts with somebody having a purpose in writing their ideas down. However, is it really necessary or even desirable to know the author's intent in order to judge whether or not a text is successful? To answer that question, you can look at the circles of communication. In successful communication, three items are required: a speaker, the utterance, and a listener. Okay, in this instance, the listener is required because that listener needs to hear and decode the message in order to successfully receive the idea that is being communicated. However, we know that the listener might have a different subtle interpretation of what that utterance is. Literature is similar. You can look at it as having those three similar types of items. You have an author, a text, and a reader. And here is where reader response comes in. Reader response says that the reader is necessary in order to create meaning from the written word. Theorist Stanley Fish concluded that the text is not the words on the page, but the minutely detailed performance they elicit from the reader. So think of it as a script, and each of us as readers is going to interpret it or perform that text a little differently. And that's because each reader will have a different frame of reference, which is influenced by upbringing, religion, race and ethnicity, education, experiences, and understanding and participation in pop culture. We know that readers fill in some gaps. They have to, because it's impossible for a writer to fully describe every detail. For example, a writer can give us a physical description of a character. They can't go into every single detail. And as readers, we start to use our imaginations and fill in some of those gaps. And we're all going to do it a little differently. The reader also fills in other missing information, such as a character's internal feelings. Those aren't always 100% described by an author, so we start automatically filling in those feelings. So these interpretations will result in some differences, mostly minor, in interpretations, but it's important to remember that reader response requires the reader to complete a responsible reading. The reader needs to complete a close reading, paying careful attention to the details that he or she is reading. In reader response theory, The reader cannot add or change events or ignore what the text says. In summary, reader response relies on the reader to complete the meaning of the text created by the author.